the very process of fighting this unsuccessful revolution, and in one sense very unsuccessful in the sense that capitalism would become more powerful than ever. In the process of fighting that unsuccessful revolution, we learn crucial lessons about the process of revolutionary change. And I think we help to produce changes that have in many ways revolutionized the way we think about human relations and the planet we collectively inhabit. We did not achieve socialism in the world, but we did discover how much more profound and complicated revolutionary processes need to be. And in the process of these struggles, questions emerged, many questions that helped to spawn new academic fields and new movements, but perhaps most importantly of all, new questions. First of all, the question regarding the relationship between racism and capitalism. Later, in the early 80s, I read a book entitled Black Marxism. Is anybody familiar with that book by Cedric Robinson? Somebody said yes? Heard of it, haven't read it. Okay. Well, it was a very enlightening text for me to read, because I came to understand that if we assume the unquestioned centrality of the West, its economic, philosophical, and cultural development, then the economic modes, the intellectual histories, the religions and cultures associated with Africa, Asia, and indigenous people will never be acknowledged as significant dimensions of humanity. The very concept of humanity will always conceal an eternal and internal clandestine racialization, forever foreclosing possibilities of racial equality. And needless to say, Marxism, and I am very happy to have been introduced at a very early age to Marxist ideas. I think I read the Communist Manifesto when I was in high school in New York, but I'm going to correct the introduction to point out that my first contact with communists, and this actually substantiates the point you made about experience. My first contact with communists came when I was a very young child, because Black communists had moved to Birmingham, Alabama, in order to organize both Black and white workers. This is during the period of the late 30s and early 40s. And some of my parents' closest friends were members of the Communist Party. And by the age of 6, I had learned that you never talk to the FBI. And as a matter of fact, when I was arrested, I did not talk to the FBI. I kept hearing my mother's and other voices in my head, don't say a word to the FBI. But anyway, Cedric Robinson's analyses, which in a sense are both an embracing of and a critique of the Enlightenment context of Marxism. It revealed new ways of thinking and acting precisely through encounters between Marxism and Black intellectuals and activists who helped to constitute what Robinson called, and others such as Robin Kelly and many others have called, the Black radical tradition. Although Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery, was published in 1944, and now you know that that was the same year I was born, thanks to the introduction. The text, Capitalism and Slavery, was pretty much marginalized. And as a result, scholarly efforts exploring the relationship between racism and capitalism have remained relatively marginal, which is very bizarre, since capitalism would not exist without slavery, without colonization. And while it is important to acknowledge the pivotal role slavery and colonization played in the historical consolidation of capitalism, more recent developments linked to global capitalism cannot be adequately comprehended if the racial dimension of capitalism is ignored. So I make this point because the term that Cedric Robinson used is racial capitalism. That capitalism is racial capitalism. It is impossible to begin to understand the workings of capitalism without recognizing that racism resides at its very core. So this means that we have to take very seriously the fact that histories of colonialism and slavery cannot simply be relegated to the past as moments that can be transcended by attempting to assimilate Black subjects and subjects from the global South into an unchanged Enlightenment-based discourse of human equality. And this, of course, is what we have experienced. This is the perennial problem in the US. The assumption that racism is addressed by simply assimilating those who have been targeted by racism into a society that remains as racist as it was to begin with. The racism underlying these histories of colonialism and slavery are now asserting themselves with a vengeance. Here in Europe, but also in Africa, in Australia, in North America, the failure to address what is often referred to as the refugee crisis or the immigration crisis represents the contemporary presence of these histories. The deeply racist responses from failures to admit refugees by European countries to the overt Islamophobic attacks by the Trump administration, and I promised myself I wouldn't talk too much about Donald Trump, because we might end up overspending our time here. But I have to point out that the threat to build a wall to prevent Mexicans and Central Americans from entering the U.S., which of course replicates the apartheid wall in Palestine. Let us not forget that. This constitutes an effort to ignore the contemporary consequences of those histories of colonialism. And since I evoked the Israeli occupation of Palestine, let me say that that represents not only the most egregious form of contemporary settler colonialism, but a settler colonial state that is intent on continuing to expand. As a matter of fact, solidarity with the Palestinian struggle and support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement should be on the agenda of all progressive struggles today. You know, someone told me that Sahar Francis might be Sahar Francis is the leader of the Palestinian organization Adamir, supporting political prisoners, and I want to personally acknowledge the extremely important work that you have done. Thank you so much for your work. I was extremely happy to be able to witness and assist in developing the ties of solidarity between Black movements in the U.S. and the Palestinian movement, not only because I feel it is our responsibility to offer that solidarity, but because of the fact that we have a great deal to learn from the Palestinian struggle. When we look at the struggle in Palestine, it becomes clear that state violence against Black communities in the U.S. cannot be eradicated by simply hiring better police officers, by hiring police who are less racist or who have attended anti-racism workshops. And of course, all the while keeping the police apparatus intact. And that apparatus incorporates some of the histories of colonialism and slavery I was referring to. So it has been very helpful to activist groups in the U.S. who have learned an enormous amount from our relationship with the Palestinian struggle. So thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you here, Sahar. Thank you. The point I'm trying to make is that revolutionary change is impossible as long as we do not address the extent to which repressive apparatuses, police, prisons, etc., and the social structures preserve these racialized and racist histories. I guess I'm suggesting also that the Enlightenment imperative of progress, that we always look toward future progress. And the West, the countries of the global North, come to symbolize that progress. progress, which places Africa, other countries in the global south at a great disadvantage. But if we assent to that imperative of always looking toward future progress, it prevents us from seriously engaging with the past. I think about white people in the US who try to excuse themselves from responsibility for the continued reproduction of racist structures and discourses by saying, "But I never owned slaves," or "I never attacked Native Americans," or "I never joined the Ku Klux Klan." This simplistic, neoliberal, individualistic notion of responsibility that denies the impact of history is precisely the reason why so many historical conjunctures in the US have been defined by racial explosions. In the US, and you can draw your own conclusions about the situation in Europe, but I can say that I have experienced on many occasions efforts on the part of white people in Europe to point elsewhere as the site of racism. That the US has been the site of racism. And South Africa has been the site of racism, but failing to examine and critically engage with racism within their own backyards. And I say this because, I can remember when, and I'm going off script here, if that's okay. I can remember when I traveled in Europe to thank people for the amazing organizing that was done around the demand for my freedom. I know that I would not be free today had it not been for the millions of people throughout the continent of Europe who stood up and said no to racism and repression in the US. And I am deeply thankful to every person who was involved in that movement. And at the same time, I can say that I was very disappointed when many of the same people were reluctant to engage in conversations about immigrants way back when. Or when I would visit France, and most of my friends in France were, from Africa or Haiti or Guadeloupe, or, they were Black people. But then I would hear France being referred to as a white country, as if Black people and what we call people of color in the US did not exist. And I think that there may be something of a problem like that here, where certain populations are rendered invisible, not even recognized. And you see where we are in the US. We have never seriously considered the irreparable damage done by the enslavement of African-descended people and the genocidal colonization of indigenous people. when attempts to spur popular engagement with these histories are made, then Black subjects and indigenous subjects are represented largely as the objects of unending violence, and thus in a process that is explicitly designed to rehabilitate them, are further dehumanized and transformed into humans for whom pity is supposed to be experienced, but with whom otherwise no essential connection is allowed. And of course, I could pose the same question here in Catalonia. Have you begun to address the lasting effects of colonization? Have you addressed the legacies of fascism? And I can tell you that when I saw the images of the police attacking demonstrators, was that last Sunday? That was the first thing that came to my mind, because I'm a person who was very much informed by solidarity with the movement against Franco. And in my political formation, the reason I asked you what song you were going to sing, the revolutionary songs that I learned how to sing were songs of the Spanish Civil War. But anyway, while we tend to define revolutionary change as a radical dismantling and remaking of economic structures in society, and of course, I have no qualms at all with this. This is what we have to do, but we cannot then ignore the realm of consciousness. Over the last 3 years in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement has served as a catalyst for radically different ways of understanding racism in US society and beyond. And I can tell you that I am shocked to hear conventional mainstream news reporters engaged in all of these reports on racism. It used to be that racism was a bad word. It could not even be pronounced in public. As a matter of fact, when Barack Obama was elected to the presidency, that was represented as the advent of our post-racial era. And of course, race came back with a vengeance, with a major vengeance. But it has been thoroughly exciting to witness the ways in which new youth formations, revolutions are always made by the youth. And those of us who are older have to learn how to take leadership from young people. I always say it's a wonderful time to be young this period because so many changes. But also it's a great time to be old because one gets to see the fruits of the work one has done for decades and decades in the ability of young people to engage the issues that we groped our way towards understanding with such facility. And I say this because I see a new feminist-inflected internationalism in Black activism that highlights the value of queer theories and practices. And I also see a structure of leadership which challenges the conventional masculinist, individualistic, charismatic notion of leadership that we've had to deal with for as long as I know. I see the offering of a notion of leadership that is collective. And so when one looks at the organization, the network Black Lives Matter, there are 3 Black women who are the co-leaders of that movement. But I wanted to, do I have time? I wanted to say a few words about the tendency to assume that Black Lives Matter, for example, represents the return of the Black Panther Party. And of course there's always the tendency to want to do a compare and contrast, kind of analysis. But if one considers the relationship between the Black Panther Party, which celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2016, is that right? Last year it was founded in 1966, yes. So as we consider the relationship between the Black Panther Party and the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, and of course there are many organizations. There's Black Youth Project, there's Assata's Daughters, there's the Dream Defenders, there's Justice League. There are a whole number of Black youth organizations across the country. But if one considers the relationship between the Black Panther Party and the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, it feels like the decades and generations that separate one from the other create a certain incommensurability as a consequence of all of the economic and political and cultural and technological changes that make the contemporary moment so different in many important respects from the late 1960s. So I was thinking perhaps we should seek connections between the two movements that are revealed not so much in the similarities, but rather through their radical differences. The Black Panther Party emerged as a response to the police occupation of Oakland, California, which incidentally is where I have lived for the last 40 years or so. The police occupation of Oakland and many other urban communities across the country. It was an absolutely brilliant move on the part of Huey Newton and Bobby Seale to patrol the neighborhood with guns and law books. The gun representing resistance and the law book representing democratic rights. So you know that story, right? About what they did. They simply would go up to the police who would be arresting someone, and they'd ask the people with the law book, are you aware of your rights? And the gun, which at that point was legal, it is not now legal to carry a weapon in public in California, as it is in Texas and Kansas and many other places, but that's another question. And you know about the problems we have with gun violence. And so basically what they did was to police the police. They policed the police. They patrolled the police. And At the same time, this strategy, it was admittedly also inspired by the emergence of guerrilla struggles in Cuba, liberation struggles in Southern Africa and in the Middle East, and by the successful resistance offered by the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. But in retrospect, this strategy, which was so brilliant and led to the expansion of the Black Panther Party, not only all over the country, but all over the world. But in retrospect, it reflected a failure to recognize, as Audre Lorde put it, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. In other words, the use of guns, even primarily as symbols of resistance, conveyed the message that the police could be challenged effectively by relying on explicitly policing strategies. And I'm being self-critical here in these reflections on our time 50 years ago. Black Lives Matter, which initially emerged in the aftermath of the hashtag emerged in the aftermath of the killing of Trayvon Martin. And then in Ferguson, 2014, the protest in Ferguson spurred the three women, Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, and Patrisse Cullors, to create a network. And this manifested a collective desire to demand justice for Mike Brown, who was killed in Ferguson, and for all of the Black lives sacrificed on the altar of racist police terror. But they also asked us to radically resist the racist violence at the very heart of policing structures and strategies. Black Lives Matter very early on recognized that we could not simply demand accountability for individual police officers. Rather, we would have to place the demand to demilitarize the police at the very center of our efforts to move toward a more critical and more collective mode of justice. And this was ultimately linked to an approach that calls for abolition of policing as we know and experience it. Demilitarization also contested the ways in which police strategies have been transnationalized within circuits that link very small U.S. police departments, such as the one in Ferguson, Missouri, to Israel, which dominates the arena of militarized policing, associated, of course, with the occupation of Palestine. So you see the movement from policing the police to developing an understanding of the role of militarization within police departments, which allowed us to recognize the extent to which police departments are descended from slave patrols historically, and at the same time, in receiving this so-called counter-terror training, it links our understanding of racism with the emergence of a terrible Islamophobia that is justified by the so-called war on terror. And so it means that our understanding of racism has to become more complicated. If Islamophobia becomes one of the most spectacular and dramatic expressions of racism today. And so this means that Black people who want to challenge racism must necessarily engage in actions of solidarity with Muslims and with people who are mistakenly identified as Muslims. So we're talking about revolution, right? And I'm trying to suggest that the way we understand our worlds makes a difference. And I haven't, I was actually going to also do another comparison, which I'll just abbreviate. The Black Panther Party attempted, sometimes really unsuccessfully, to embrace feminism. And perhaps it was a sign of the era. Many people aren't even aware of the fact that the majority of the members of the Black Panther Party were women. Those who built the movement were women. But of course it was a masculinist, militarist movement that required women to become more masculinist than the men in order, well, that's, but, and also during that period, there was an attempt to embrace the gay liberation movement. There's a very interesting article that Huey Newton wrote in the newspaper, The Black Panther, laying out all of the reasons why radical Black activists needed to support the gay liberation movement, which was somewhat different from the LGBTQ movement today in a number of respects, which has, and I'll say parenthetically, we always seem to capitulate to processes of assimilation. And in supporting ardently LGBTQ issues, I also have to say that the emergence of marriage equality as the central demand represents an assimilationist effort. The gay liberation movement at that time was critical of the capitalist structures of marriage and the nuclear family. And I always ask myself, why is it not possible to make demands for civil rights, such as marriage equality, but at the same time point out that this is not the path to liberation? That, as a matter of fact, it's an oppressive institution based on property, distribution, and inheritance. And perhaps let me move on to say that, the mainstream feminist movement has made serious mistakes. I often point out that when I wrote a book that was published in 1981 called Women, Race, and Class, everybody started referring to me as a feminist, and my response was, I'm not a feminist. I'm a black revolutionary. Because I didn't see how the two had anything to do with each other. But I realized that I was talking about a certain kind of feminism, a bourgeois feminism, a feminism that is still, unfortunately, white bourgeois feminism, which is unfortunately the most represented feminism today, and most people think of that as feminism. But that ignores the fact that huge numbers of organic and academic intellectuals who are women of color have transformed the very nature of feminism. And the hallmark of feminism today is what we call intersectionality, a recognition of and not only the interrelating character of identities, but as I frequently say, I think intersectionality is most helpful when we think about the intersectionality of social justice struggles. The mistake made by mainstream feminism and its continued reliance on categorical representations of women. As soon as one assumes that women can be categorically represented, it means that there is some clandestine racialization happening there, right? And you hear the term glass ceiling feminism. I don't know whether you have that here. Glass ceiling feminism. This is what Hillary Clinton represented. But glass ceiling feminism is represented, it's grounded from the very outset in hierarchies. I mean, how else does that metaphor work? Those who are already high enough to reach the ceiling are probably white, and then if they're not white, they are already affluent because they're at the top. All they have to do is push through the ceiling. And as long as I have identified as a feminist, it has been clear to me that any feminism that privileges those who already have privilege is bound to be irrelevant to poor women, working class women, women of color, trans women of color. If standards for feminism are created by those who have already ascended economic hierarchies and are attempting to make the last climb to the top, how is this relevant to women who are at the very bottom? Revolutionary hope resides precisely among those women who have been abandoned by history and who are now standing up and making their demands heard. I truly believe, and men should applaud this, that this is the era of women. I truly believe that. And I am referring not to the women who only have to break the ceiling to get where they want to go. But I'm referring to the women at the very bottom, poor women, black women, Muslim women, indigenous women, queer women, trans women. As a matter of fact, trans women of color have been most despised, most subject to state violence, most subject to individual violence. And so it seems to me that we can say that people who have suffered in that way, when they begin to rise, the whole world will rise with them. The whole world will rise with them. If we stand up against racism, we want much more than inclusion. Inclusion is not enough. Diversity is not enough. And as a matter of fact, we do not wish to be included in a racist society. If we say no to heteropatriarchy, then we do not want to be assimilated into a misogynist and heteropatriarchal society. If we say no to poverty, we do not want to be contained by a capitalist structure that values profits more than human beings. If we recognize that those who wanted to solve the problem of slavery by creating more humane forms of slavery were employing the logic of racism, we say that those who call for police reform and prison reform while retaining the racist structures as they pretend to address the problems of racism, that they are absolutely wrong. And this is why we say no to carceral feminism and yes to abolition feminism. Yes to abolition feminism. And so I want to conclude by suggesting that our notion of revolution, our notions of revolution, need to be far more capacious than they have been in the past. Certainly, we need to dispose of what has become an unmanageable system of global capitalism that permits the 8 richest billionaires in the world to control as much wealth as the poorest half of the population. That is absolutely obscene. And even those billionaires should think that it's obscene. But also recognize that we must be prepared to continually challenge that which appears to us to be most normal. Revolution upsets normative processes, class-based, gender-based, race-based, sexuality-based, ability-based, and I'm just beginning the list. And in this sense, there will always be revolutions looming in the future. Thank you very much.